Eric Arthur Blair, more commonly known by his pen name George Orwell, is one of the most influential and celebrated authors of the 20th century and potentially of all time. His works are studied in classrooms around the world and center on themes such as anti-authoritarianism. Orwell's life was very eventful, having been born in India during the days of the British Empire before traveling around the world writing. One of the most significant episodes of Orwell's life, and one that I would say most people don't know enough about, is his service during the Spanish Civil War, fighting alongside the pro Republican forces against the forces of fascism on the nationalist side. Although in the modern era both the left and right attempt to co opt Orwell for their own agendas and political narratives, Orwell's service in the leftist militias associated with the Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista during the war, combined with his outspoken advocacy for socialism through his writings, make it abundantly clear where his loyalties lay. This video focuses specifically on that episode of Orwell's life and will examine what Orwell was doing before he flew to Spain, his motivations and what he did during the war, what factors forced his sudden exit from Spain before the war's conclusion, and his retrospective thoughts on his experiences. Orwell arrived in Spain on the 26th of December 1936, several months after the Civil War had started. In the prior months, Orwell had been staying in Britain, continuing to write novels and stories, finishing a draft of On the Road to Wigan Pier in October. He had seemingly been rushing himself to complete his writing upon hearing of the news of a workers' uprising in Spain that summer, and felt compelled to be involved in some fashion. In Homage to Catalonia, Orwell writes at the start of the Civil War, quote, "When the fighting broke out on 18 July, it is probable that every anti-fascist in Europe felt a thrill of hope, for here, at last, apparently, was democracy standing up to fascism. For years past, the so-called democratic countries had been surrendering to fascism at every step. The Japanese had been allowed to do as they liked in Manchuria. Hitler had walked into power and proceeded to massacre political opponents of all shades. Mussolini had bombed the Abyssinians while 53 nations made pious notes off. But when Franco tried to overthrow a mildly left-wing government, the Spanish people, against all expectation, had risen against him. It seemed, possibly it was, the turning of the tide." His wife Eileen shared a similar sentiment and wanted to go with him. Orwell had reservations, however, owing to his weak lungs, whether or not he would be physically able to fight or would be confined solely to writing about the war, whilst others did the fighting for him. To get to Spain, Orwell was told he would need supporting documents from a left-wing organization, otherwise he would be rejected. Although this was inaccurate, Orwell approached the British Communist Party for documents, speaking directly to its chief, Harry Pollitt. Pollitt eventually rejected Orwell for being too politically unreliable and describing him as a disillusioned middle-class boy. Orwell then approached the Independent Labour Party, who granted him the requisite documents and he would serve in the ILP's contingent. Orwell initially travelled to Paris, then on a night train to the Spanish border. Upon reaching Spain, Orwell watched in admiration as his train received salutes from workers and peasants, like a guard of honour. He initially wanted to join the international brigades, but felt compelled to at least first meet the ILP's representative John McNair in POUM headquarters in Barcelona as a courtesy. The POUM, short for Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista, translated to English as Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, was affiliated with the ILP, and McNair was responsible as a British representative to help coordinate funding efforts for the POUM. The conversation between the two was brief, and McNair confirmed that Orwell would join the POUM. With that, McNair, a fan of Orwell's writings, took Orwell to the Lenin Barracks, the POUM's military headquarters. The Lenin Barracks had previously been a military cavalry barracks that was seized by POUM members when the fighting broke out in July. Although Orwell had originally been told he would be sent to the front following him joining the militia, he was forced to wait a while whilst the new Centuria was ready. The Centuria was a unit of command in the militia, which was not structured like a hierarchical military. The smallest unit was a section comprising 30 men, a centuria 100 men, and a column, which had no fixed number but consisted of any larger number of men. Orwell was disgusted by the state of the Lenin barracks, which was plagued, as he described it, by a frightful wastage of food and in a state of filth and chaos. The Lenin barracks was distinguished by the big portrait of Lenin that hung over the main gate at its entrance. Being forced to wait a week, he was asked to help lead some of the drills to train the soldiers, being that Orwell had some military-style discipline and experience owing to his service as a policeman for the Empire in Burma. It was clear to Orwell initially that although the militiamen lacked nothing for enthusiasm or courage, they had little preparation or training relative to their fascist counterparts, who were better equipped and receiving increasing support from Germany and Italy in the form of weapons, troops, and training. Orwell describes the militia's equipment as being issued piecemeal, with something resembling uniforms being issued to soldiers and things like belts and cartridges really only being given to them right before they were to ship off to the front. The eager soldiers of Orwell's unit consisted largely of 16 or 17-year-old boys, and were not even taught how to fire their rifle or arm and throw a grenade, let alone basic infantry tactics, before being deployed in combat. Even in December, there was a crippling lack of rifles, so much so that soldiers on their way to the front had to get rifles from those coming back. Orwell formed a glowing opinion of the Catalonian Revolution in his short time staying in Barcelona. He was under the impression that all the militias, regardless of ideology, were united in fighting the fascists. He was impressed by the seemingly egalitarian spirit of Barcelona and became convinced that this state of affairs was worth fighting for. Orwell knew little about the POUM and even less about the complicated state of affairs in Spain at the time. He had no idea that the POUM's and his own credibility was being undermined by Stalinist machinations, and Stalin required unconditional obedience from the militias in order to receive support from the Soviet Union. After a week of so-called training and instruction, and lacking much of the required equipment, Orwell's Centuria was marshalled to the train station 3 or 4 miles away from their barracks, amidst a flurry of red and black banners and Marxist slogans. At some time past 8 p.m., the train crowded with militiamen left Barcelona, chugging comfortably towards the Aragon front. As Orwell's Centuria approached the front line by truck, he drove past the villages of Sietamo and Alcubierre, small towns that had been devastated by the shell fire of previous battles. The fighting on the Aragon front, and similarly along many other fronts in the Spanish Civil War at this stage, was akin to the trench warfare of World War I, with trench lines snaking through the Spanish countryside, and the fascists and republicans pitted opposite one another. In Orwell's words, quote, "According to my ideas of trench warfare, the fascists would be 50 or 100 yards away. I could see nothing. Seemingly, their trenches were very well concealed. Then, with a shock of dismay, on the opposite hilltop beyond the ravine, 700 meters away at the very least, the tiny outline of a parapet and a red and yellow flag, the fascist position. I was indescribably disappointed." Orwell's time in the Aragon front was largely uneventful, and he writes in Homage to Catalonia that he only saw significant action at Teruel and Huesca. Life on the front was filled with boredom and mundanity, the trenches being too far away from one another that even if you came under machine gun fire, there was little danger of actually being hit. Both the fascists and republicans were entrenched on hilltops overlooking the valley, with each outpost being marked with a respective flag of the trade union or political party the militia serving there was affiliated with. The fascists usually either flew the red and yellow monarchist flag or the red, yellow, purple flag of the Republic, though this was rare. As Georges Kopp, Belgian anti-fascist and Orwell's commander and close friend, said of the war, quote, "This is not a war. It is a comic opera with an occasional death." 3 weeks later, Orwell moved into a position at Monte Oscuro near Zaragoza, and although the trenches were much closer to the enemy, combat was similarly very rare. Orwell found that he had fired his rifle very infrequently, noting that he had only fired 3 shots in 3 weeks of fighting, and quipped amusingly, quote, "They say it takes 1,000 bullets to kill a man, and at this rate it would be 20 years before I killed my first fascist." Much of the fighting was also done verbally, with both sides shouting their respective political slogans. The shouts from anarchists and socialists usually were centered around themes of anti-capitalism and class struggle, noting that many of the fascist soldiers were also likely working class and shared more in common with the left than Franco. Orwell notes that such shouting was effective to a degree, as some of the trickle of fascist deserters were won over by the slogans. In Homage to Catalonia, Orwell writes, quote, "If one comes to think of it, when some poor devil of a sentry, very likely a socialist or anarchist trade union member who has been conscripted against his will, is freezing at his post, the slogan, 'Don't fight against your own class,' ringing again and again through the darkness is bound to make an impression on him." There were a few more engagements, but again very few casualties on either side, and in mid-February, Orwell's troops moved off the line at Monte Oscuro to Huesca. At Huesca, as Orwell notes in his words, almost literally nothing happened until late March. Although Orwell was part of the POUM, which was explicitly anti-Stalinist, he seemed to be more sympathetic to the Stalinist official position on the socialist revolution and the war. The POUM and the anarchists believed that the war and the revolution were inseparable, and for the war to be won, the revolution must continue. The Stalinist line, on the other hand, was, quote, "the war first and the revolution afterwards." Orwell at this stage considered it a matter of practicality, and that ultimately no revolution would take place if the fascists eventually won, and he grew tired of the constant debates over ideology in the barracks or barns where he and his men were billeted. Although Orwell had come to the war with little understanding of the inner conflict among the Republican forces, his idle time in Wesker made him more enlightened. He became aware of the feud between the CNT and the POUM, but even more so the feud between the Communists and the POUM/CNT. The POUM was denounced in the Stalinist press as being Trotskyists, fascists, and Franco's fifth column. He noted also that this was mainly propagated by newspapers and journalists who were mouthpieces of the relevant political organizations, while the actual soldiers on the ground, the Communists and International Brigade volunteers, never uttered such expletives towards Orwell or his men in person. The only action Orwell saw at Wesker was the attack on the Manicomio, an asylum that the fascists had converted to a fortress. The main attack was to be led by the Bataillon de Czech, a group of German volunteers, and was supported by another militia who were to take the adjacent hill. The militia failed, and the main attack with it too. Being dissatisfied with the POUM's stance on the war and the inaction on his front, Orwell was determined to leave the POUM and join the communist-controlled international brigades. After 115 days on the front line, Orwell went on leave in Barcelona near the end of April. Upon reaching the city, Orwell notes with a complete change in atmosphere compared to December of 1936. Gone were the black and red banners of the working class organizations, gone were the blue overalls of the workers, now replaced with fancy suits, and there was an abundance of popular army officers, that is, the officers of the governmental army, roaming the streets. The autonomy of the militias was being chipped away as the government attempted to integrate them into the structure of the Popular Army. The POUM militia, previously known as the Lenin Division, were now called the 29th Division. Victories won by the militia were now credited to the Popular Army as a whole, while its failures were blamed on those same militias. Orwell began to make the arrangements to join the international brigades by speaking to a communist friend of his, hoping to be sent to participate in the fighting near Madrid, but the ominous signs of conflict were looming large over Barcelona. The sudden presence of the Popular Army in numbers that hadn't been seen before, the presence of the civil and assault guards in Barcelona once again, now heavily armed, indicated that something was going to happen. There were several killings that took place during April between CNT and UGT members, and when May approached, and so did May Day, the CNT leadership tried to reconcile with the UGT and form a coalition of trade unions to stage a unified demonstration to celebrate. This was called off, and Orwell notes in Homage to Catalonia that, quote, Barcelona, the so-called revolutionary city, was probably the only city in non-fascist Europe that had no celebrations that day. Towards the end of April, the Republican government had taken several measures to disempower the CNT and POUM. On the 25th of April, Juan Negrin sent carabineros to take over anarchist posts on the Pyrenean frontier, and José Cazorla closed down the CNT newspaper Solidaridad Obrera the same day. On May 3rd, the Generalitat attempted to seize the telephone exchange in Barcelona, which had been controlled by the anarchists thus far. 3 trucks of assault guards besieged the exchange, and in the wake of the developing chaos, Orwell was posted on the roof of a cinema to guard the approach to the POUM headquarters. From this position, Orwell could view much of the city, but he was totally confused as to who was fighting who was winning, why they were fighting, and what, in general, was going on. On the evening of the 5th, Orwell was notified by Georges Kopp that the government was going to outlaw the POUM and declare a state of war against it. Fortunately, on the 6th, things seemed to return to some sort of normality, and an informal armistice had taken place. By the 7th, any remaining fighting had come to an end, but the government used the fighting as an excuse to assume greater control over Catalonia. The militias were being broken up, CNT arms were being seized and redistributed, and the NKVD were sharing grandiose Stalinist rumors to Moscow, spreading them throughout Spain as well. The POUM were denounced as Trotskyists and fascists once again, in spite of the fact that Trotsky had denounced the POUM in his Fourth International. After the chaos had subsided, Orwell had decided firmly that he was not going to join the international brigades nor any communist unit. He decided against common sense to remain in the POUM and stay loyal to his comrades. Just 3 days after the fighting ended, Orwell was back again at the front, this time as part of the 29th Division as opposed to his previous name, the Lenin Division, and Orwell was made a lieutenant under the new hierarchical military structure. At the front, he heard that Bob Smiley, an ILP representative, had been arrested on his way back to England. Once again at Wesker, there was little action, consisting largely of patrols and both sides taking pot shots at one another. Orwell did notice, however, that the fascists opposite him were more alert and better equipped, but ultimately there were no significant battles that took place. On May 20th at 5 a.m., when Orwell was scheduled to relieve an American comrade as sentry, he was shot in the throat by a fascist sniper. Orwell's lanky frame of 6 feet 3 inches made him a big target, and he was shot peeking over the parapet to survey the enemy trenches. The American comrade he was to relieve, Harry Milton, immediately rushed to his aid and called others over to tend to him, and he was immediately rushed over to a hospital in Seattle. Orwell recalled the experience of being shot as, quote, "It was the sensation of being at the center of an explosion. There seemed to be a loud bang and a blinding flash of light all around me, and I felt a tremendous shock. No pain, only a violent shock, such as you get from an electric terminal. With it, a sense of utter weakness, a feeling of being stricken and shriveled up to nothing." Orwell thought he was done for, but the bullet had missed his carotid artery by a few millimeters, and the doctors informed him of how lucky he was, to which Orwell quipped later, "I could not help thinking that it would be even luckier not to be hit at all." He was declared medically unfit and needed his documents certified before he could be allowed to leave Spain. Orwell had been away from Barcelona from the 15th to the 20th of June, and had no idea of the situation developing as he was busy getting the required documents. Andres Nin, the head of the POUM, was arrested on the 15th and tortured and murdered by NKVD agents on the 20th. The party's newspaper La Batalla was banned on May 28th. The party had been outlawed on June 16th, and government soldiers were going around arresting current members. When he reached the Hotel Continental, his wife immediately grabbed him and told him to leave, as did other POUM members. Eileen believed that the two should remain separate for most of the following days, as she suspected the authorities were using her to bait her husband and arrest them both. Kopp had been arrested at this point, and both Orwell and Eileen attempted, to no avail, to free their close friend from prison. On June 23rd, Orwell, his wife, John McNair, and Stafford Cotman, an ILP comrade of Orwell's, made their escape from Barcelona. They obtained documents from the British consulate and travelled as ordinary tourists. They were relieved when the train crossed the French border with no incident, as it meant their return to England safely was all but assured. Orwell spent a short time in France at a fishing town called Bagnols-sur-Mer before making his way to London at the end of June. Orwell's war was over, though the Spanish Civil War would rage for almost 2 more years, and he was safe from political persecution in England, albeit traumatized from his experiences. Orwell, immediately after his departure, became disillusioned with the Republican government and its actions in suppressing any dissent, whether it be the POUM or the CNT-FAI. In a letter to an admirer, Amy Charlesworth, Orwell wrote that, quote, "If fascism means suppression of political liberty and free speech, imprisonment without trial, etc., the present regime in Spain is fascism. I don't mean that the rule of the present government is no better than Franco, but it is only different in degree, not in kind." Orwell tried publishing his account of the war in various papers, including the New Statesman, but it was rejected. Only one paper, Time and Tide, published his writing. Orwell returned to his quiet life in England, meeting with other POUM volunteers and ILP members in reunion. He was also the subject of a smear campaign by the Communist Party of Great Britain and its paper The Daily Worker. Throughout his time in Spain, Soviet spies were also monitoring both Orwell and his wife. Orwell's experiences in Spain, particularly of Stalinist repression, did not dissuade him from socialism, but instead made him a lifelong anti-authoritarian, believing strongly in some form of democratic socialism. In spite of his traumatic experiences, both mentally and physically during the war, Orwell was, in his words, quote, "left with not less but more belief in the decency of human beings." Although he remained loyal to the POUM throughout his time in Spain, in spite of his disagreements with their ideology, Orwell did have some regrets, later writing that, quote, "If I had understood the situation better, I should probably have joined the anarchists." George Orwell's experiences in Spain, although relatively short, would leave an indelible mark on his life and future writings, and Homage to Catalonia, one of Orwell's most popular works and one of the best personal accounts of the conflict ever written, is definitely something everyone should read. Thanks for watching.